Donald Trump did not freeze Elizabeth Warren with a nickname. He froze her with $10.3 million, 17 years of corporate consulting, $212,000 from Travelers Insurance, and one phrase that no polished Senate answer could disinfect: asbestos victims. That is how fast a political brand can go from consumer champion to defendant under studio lights. 1 minute. Elizabeth Warren was standing inside a CNN town hall, presenting herself as the clean professor of American politics, the woman who studies corporate greed, names the villains, and promises working families that somebody in Washington still knows who crushed them. The next minute, Donald Trump was standing at the moderator's table with a thick folder, saying, in effect, if Elizabeth Warren wants to prosecute corruption tonight, then America should examine her invoices too. This was not a normal town hall. This was a televised cross-examination disguised as primetime politics. This was not a debate about tax cuts, slogans, or campaign branding. This was a live collision between Elizabeth Warren's public sermon and Elizabeth Warren's alleged paper trail. And the first exhibit was brutal because it was specific. Travelers Insurance, December 1995, $212,000. A bankruptcy fight tied to asbestos liability. Working men exposed to asbestos. Families staring at medical bills. Victims needing compensation before the clock ran out on their lungs. And according to the documents Trump displayed, Elizabeth Warren was paid as an expert by the corporate side. So the question was no longer whether Warren could deliver another speech about rigged systems. The question was whether Warren could explain why her name, her signature, and her money appeared inside the kind of corporate machinery she spent decades condemning. That is why the room went quiet. Not because Trump was loud, not because the accusation was theatrical, but because numbers have a different sound when they land on a table. A slogan can be spun. A speech can be reframed. A hostile exchange can be blamed on politics. But a contract just sits there. A payment just sits there. A signature just sits there. And when Trump began stacking Travelers Insurance, Dow Chemical, LTV Steel, corporate checks, bankruptcy work, pension fights, and environmental liability into one tight evidentiary wall, Warren's usual escape routes started closing. She could call it legal work. She could call it complex. She could call it expert testimony. But she could not make the moral contrast disappear. Because the contrast was the whole case. Elizabeth Warren had spent her hour telling America that Donald Trump was the symbol of corporate corruption. Then Trump opened the folder and asked why the symbol of anti-corruption had allegedly made millions from corporations herself. Warren's first defense was exactly what you would expect from a lawyer who knows the facts are ugly, but the paperwork is technically real. She did not say the documents were fake. She did not say the payments never happened. She did not say Travelers Insurance never paid her. She said it was legitimate expert testimony in a complex bankruptcy proceeding. And that is where the whole exchange turned from politics into prosecution. Because complex is a very useful word when someone wants to hide a simple moral problem under a pile of legal fog. Yes, bankruptcy law is complex. Yes, courts use expert witnesses. Yes, professors can be paid for analysis. But none of that answers the question sitting in the middle of the stage like a body no one wants to identify. Who benefited? That is the question. Not whether the invoice had the right letterhead. Not whether the contract was properly signed. Not whether Elizabeth Warren could describe the work in language polished enough to sound respectable. Who benefited when Travelers Insurance hired her? Who benefited when Dow Chemical allegedly paid for legal analysis tied to environmental liability? Who benefited when LTV Steel fought pension obligations while workers who had given their bodies to that company were waiting for what they had been promised? That is prosecutorial mode. You do not let the witness escape into vocabulary. You pull the answer back to the victim. And Trump, whatever anyone thinks of him, understood that instinct in this moment. He did not argue like a professor. He argued like a man pointing at the receipt and asking why the cashier is pretending the purchase never happened. Warren wanted to make it about legal procedure. Trump made it about dying workers, poisoned communities, and pensioners watching money vanish from the future they had earned. That is why the traveler's insurance number mattered so much. $212,000 is not just a payment. It is a moral photograph. On one side of that photograph, sick workers and families needed money from an insurance system built to delay, reduce, and exhaust claims. On the other side, Elizabeth Warren, future senator, future anti-corporate icon, allegedly received a corporate check for expert work inside the system those families were fighting. And when Warren said the numbers were being taken out of context, the real question became even sharper. What context makes that look clean? What context turns corporate money into working-class courage? What context transforms a paid expert for powerful companies into the pure defender of the people those companies were accused of harming? That is the part Warren could not resolve. She could explain the mechanism. She could not repair the image. And politics is often image first, explanation second. For years, Elizabeth Warren's image was easy to understand. She was the professor with the charts. She was the senator with the plan. She was the woman who could walk into a hearing room, slice through banker language, and make a CEO look like he had been caught stealing lunch money from a school cafeteria. But tonight, the image flipped. Now she was the one facing the paperwork. Now she was the one saying, "It is more complicated than that." Now she was the one asking the audience to trust a technical answer when the moral picture looked painfully simple. Then came the next layer. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Warren's signature achievement. The agency she designed, defended, and carried like proof that government could still stand between ordinary Americans and financial predators. Trump took that symbol and turned it into another exhibit. He pointed to $5.4 billion in settlements between 2011 and 2017. Then he argued that money meant to protect consumers had been routed toward progressive organizations under the language of consumer education, housing counseling, and community benefit. Warren tried to push back. She said those groups provided services. She said the CFPB protected millions of consumers. She tried to rebuild the moral frame before it collapsed completely. But Trump's accusation was not aimed at whether every program had a brochure or a mission statement. It was aimed at the design. If harmed consumers were the victims, why did the money not go directly to them? If banks overcharged people, why was the remedy not a clean refund to those people? If the agency existed to protect the public, why did the settlement pipeline look, in Trump's framing, like political infrastructure wearing a consumer protection badge? That was the second trap. The first trap was Warren's private money. The second was Warren's public power. And together they created a pattern the audience could understand without needing a law degree. When corporations paid Elizabeth Warren, the explanation was complexity. When a federal agency tied to Warren sent settlement money to aligned organizations, the explanation was community benefit. But in both cases, the same smell remained in the air. Money moved. Power benefited. Ordinary people were asked to accept the lecture. Then Trump moved to the part of the folder that made the room colder. Stock trades, committee briefings, dates lined up like fingerprints on glass. This was no longer just about what Elizabeth Warren allegedly did before she became the anti-corporate professor on television. This was about what she allegedly did while sitting inside the United States Senate, on the Senate Banking Committee, where information moves before the public ever hears a word. The accusation was brutally simple. Warren had access to briefings about regulations, banks, financial pressure, and market risks. Then trades allegedly followed. March 2015, a briefing about credit card regulations. 3 days later, a Visa stock purchase. 1 week later, favorable regulations became public. Visa jumped, and money was allegedly made. July 2016, a briefing about European banking stress. 2 days later, financial stocks were sold. Then the market dropped, and losses were allegedly avoided. That is not a slogan. That is a timeline. And when a timeline starts matching money, people stop hearing politics and start hearing evidence. Warren's defense was that a financial advisor handled her investments. But that answer did not kill the question. Because the question was not only who pressed the button, The question was whether private government information became private financial advantage. That is the kind of thing Warren built her career condemning. When bankers profit from inside access, she calls it corruption. When lobbyists profit from inside access, she calls it corruption. When billionaires know the rules before ordinary families do, she calls the system rigged. So what should Americans call it when Elizabeth Warren allegedly trades around information the public did not have? That was the trap. Trump was not asking the audience to understand securities law. He was asking them to understand fairness. Then he widened the frame again. Harvard records, diversity listings, the Native American claim, the 2018 DNA test. This was not just about ancestry. It was about credibility. Trump's argument was that Warren did not merely carry a family story. He argued that institutions treated that claim as professional currency, while the Cherokee Nation rejected it as improper. Now the pattern was impossible to ignore. Corporate money while attacking corporate greed. Settlement pipelines while preaching consumer protection. Trades after briefings while condemning insider privilege. Identity claims while benefiting from elite institutions. One scandal can be spun. 2 can be survived. 3 becomes a warning. 4 starts to look like a system. And that is why Warren's anger did not save her. Anger works when the audience thinks you are being smeared. Anger fails when the audience is still looking at receipts. Picture the asbestos worker coughing through the night. Picture the steel worker opening a pension statement and realizing decades of labor just got smaller. Picture the ordinary voter investing with public information, while a senator allegedly moves around private briefings. That was the moral contrast. Power had explanations. Victims had consequences. Warren had context. Trump had documents. And the room had to decide which sounded more real. And that is where the clip reaches its real moral climax. Not when Donald Trump raises his voice. Not when Elizabeth Warren gets angry. Not when the audience starts demanding yes or no answers. The real climax comes when Warren's public identity finally crashes into the people she claimed to protect. The asbestos worker, the steel worker, the poisoned family, the ordinary voter, the person without a Harvard title, without a Senate office, without a legal team, without a polished explanation ready for every uncomfortable number. Those are the people Warren built her brand around. She told them the system was rigged. She told them corporations had too much power. She told them insiders wrote rules for themselves while working families paid the bill. Then Trump's folder suggested something devastating. Maybe Warren was not outside that rigged system. Maybe she knew exactly how to work it. That is why her walk-off mattered. It was not just bad television. It was not just a dramatic exit. It was the visual ending to the entire argument. When the documents were on the table, when the audience wanted direct answers, when the questions had been stripped down to facts, Warren did not deliver the clean moral answer her brand required. She left. And in politics, leaving can be louder than speaking. An empty chair can become testimony. A silent stage can become a closing argument. Because this was bigger than Donald Trump versus Elizabeth Warren. This was bigger than one cable news ambush. This was about whether the standards politicians preach actually apply to the politicians preaching them. If a regular worker lies on a form, he can lose his job. If a small investor trades on hidden information, investigators do not call it nuance. If an ordinary family misses a payment, the system does not pause and ask for context. It charges fees, it sends notices, it squeezes. But when powerful people are caught between their speeches and their records, suddenly everything becomes complicated. The payment needs context. The trade needs nuance. The identity claim needs sympathy. The settlement pipeline needs a long policy explanation. That is the insult, not just the alleged corruption. The insult is expecting ordinary Americans to accept complexity from powerful people while receiving punishment from the same system without mercy. So the final question is simple. How many times can a politician stand next to money, power, privilege, and insider advantage before the public stops calling it coincidence? Was this a political ambush? Or was this accountability finally walking onto the stage with receipts? Drop your answer in the comments. Like this video if you want more breakdowns that follow the evidence, not the spin. Share it with someone who still thinks speeches matter more than records. And subscribe, because the next buried receipt may be the one they hoped America would never see.